Hey everyone, welcome to virtual today. So you get a couple assignments. The first one today is to work on the descriptive research advertisement. Again, you are going to be creating one that is either a magazine style or like poster style that has some titles like you're saying survey, and then has some pictures, and then what are some advantages and disadvantages, doing it more visual. Or you can make a media upload by using the Canvas upload recorder, and you can either do like kind of like your face and your like TV screen. You can hold up some stuff if you want. You can be as creative or non-creative as you want. Just saying some disadvantages and advantages of that, or you could do like a radio style advertisement, whatever is the style that you prefer to do. So I'm going to go over some advantages and disadvantages to help you guys out and to make sure we cover those important things about descriptive research. So let's start with our natural observation settings, just like we looked at with gorillas in the mist and in class. What are some advantages and disadvantages of that? We talked about intrinsic studies and extrinsic studies, and how intrinsic has some advantages and extrinsic has disadvantages or advantages as well. Just generally, the advantages of a natural setting is it has high ecological validity, meaning that ecological validity means things that are happening in the environment, natural environment, that its advantages is that it does have high validity because it's happening in its natural environment, as opposed to like an experiment, which might have to happen in a laboratory setting, which would not be the natural environment. So high ecological value, obviously, because it's in the natural setting, but only if the researcher knows his or her presence has not affected the study. Okay, so if you're doing intrinsic, like Dana Fossey was doing, she has to make sure her data isn't skewed by her interaction with the gorillas. Also can give really detailed accounts because you are involved. Extrinsic advantages, you're reducing the participation and sort of that skew and bias that might happen if you remove yourself from the subjects. In a controlled environment, you can have observations in controlled environments like in a lab. The advantages is each participant is exposed to the same situation, as opposed to where the gorillas were possibly exposed to things in the forest or the jungle that another gorilla would not be. This is more controlled. The generalizations of that data is really confident that you can generalize to a larger population, and you can also use special equipment in a lab that you couldn't do in a natural setting. In addition, the researchers become part of the group. Direct contact means that you can get more knowledge and more in-depth knowledge. Some disadvantages though, ethics is a problem. If you are trying to study the behaviors of people in an elevator and they don't know that you're actually observing them, that could be considered some kind of deception of some sort. Intrusive observation could increase participation expectancy. So just like we talked about with the Hawthorne effect, if somebody knows that you're observing them, it's a possibility they might, have skewed the data because they're trying to participate in a certain way. In the controlled natural setting, the disadvantages is that it obviously lacks that natural ecological validity when people are not in their real life environment. It does become kind of time consuming. Researchers can lose their objectivity, obviously, too, if she's getting involved with that gorilla digit. Does she become emotionally attached that she may not record something in the right manner that somebody else would? Okay, so that's advantages for that. In terms of case study, this is when you're compiling information from a variety of sources. Might be if you're studying a certain child in a school who has a unique case, you might be talking about their and interviewing parents and teachers. So those are interviews. You might be doing a questionnaire from the child. You might be looking at standardized test scores, something more like quantitative data that might be collected grades, things like that. And so for the advantages, if you have rare cases of people either like some kind of brain injury and like how they're doing in school, it could be even a city, like something that's going on, like why is it in Detroit, there's so much poverty as opposed to another city. You could be looking at that as a case study. So rare cases can be studied, events, organizations, and so forth. It has a lot of rich qualitative data because it's pulling from all different sources, and a lot of ecological validity as well. Disadvantages, no, it can't, when you study a case study, it's just that you can't apply it to the larger population because it's just not, it's more rare in a lot of cases. Also, the researcher can have a little bit of bias there if they have, if they even develop over time a feeling for this subject and so forth. And you also, the experimenter needs to be trained in all of the various data points that you would be looking for and multiple methods of data collection. So that may be a disadvantage if they're not trained in all those things. In terms of surveys, we have to think too, you know, would you volunteer to participate in a survey for research? Are there certain like topics that you would not be comfortable answering questions and so forth? And so there's a little disadvantages sometimes, like people don't want to participate, especially if somebody knows who they are and they want to stay anonymous, or even some of the questions they may lie about because they're not comfortable with some of the answers that they would give. So there are difficulties when using surveys to get a representative sample of participants because some people may not want to volunteer. So surveys, they make statistical inferences about a larger population. So they usually concentrate on a behavior or have broader goals or have some large scale campaign that they're trying to accomplish by getting in those statistics and those correlations. For advantages for a survey, it's very direct. It's a very simple method. A lot of people use them, and that's a good thing. There's many objectives studied at the same time. So as you can see, that survey that's there, there's multiple questions and all kinds of data that can be compiled at once. So that makes it very inefficient and inexpensive when that happens. And if we do our sampling right of our survey, then it can be generalized to the larger population pretty easily. With disadvantages having a true representative sample. Some people may not, again, want to participate. You may not get surveys back from people, and then it's not randomized. And if you're, of course, trying to do a stratified sample where you're trying to find a certain amount of gender or ethnicity or age group, you may not get all of that. So that's somewhat of a disadvantage. The wording of questions, again, you have to be really careful of that. They're not going to skew you towards your hypothesis or make people feel uncomfortable that they'll lie. People who respond to the survey may be different than those who refused. And honesty, of course, and that's social acceptance. You know, if they know that you're going to know who they are, they may answer a certain way. And then ethics, if you send it via email, they don't know if they understand. They may not know, and they may not consent to taking that survey. And so forth. So we need to, depending on what the survey is going to be used for, the ethics, you know, you may need to have that consent if they're going to be in a study. For questionnaires, this one is a specific topic that's studied on human characteristics, attitudes, and beliefs. Some advantages. So closed questions have a choice of responses, and an open-ended are more the detailed answers. So if you're going to use a questionnaire that has a yes or a no answer, for instance, that would be a closed. That's simple and quick and straightforward. However, those closed questions may be very limited on the amount of information, and they don't have a lot of detail on them, like yes or no, but there's no why, so they might lack some validity. On open-ended, where they provide a detailed answer, obviously then that advantage is going to be the detail of that, but it's also very time-consuming to complete and analyze. And everybody has different responses. To compare that's going to be really statistically difficult. So you have to come up with keys and patterns and categories for those answers to try to fit an answer in with others so that you can compare data between people. So this is an example of a questionnaire. Obviously it has this is all closed questions. The yes, no, I don't know, and then the scale there would be another thing to use. Okay, and then interviews are face-to-face and get someone's point of view on something, and you may do that several times to gather information. So advantages, now you have structured and unstructured, where structured is a set of questions with a selection of answers, and all the subjects get the same answer, as opposed to unstructured, there's no set questions, and you kind of use like the previous question to move on to the next question. So for the structure, the good thing about the fixed thing is very easy for comparison. So data-wise, you may want to look at that in terms of structure and being able to compare data pretty readily. The disadvantage of a structure, it's only limited information. It's only what you put on those fixed questions, and there's no further explanation. Even if you want to ask them another question, if you want to keep that comparison easy, you have to stick to those set questions. Unstructured is longer, obviously, but it gives a lot of detailed information and that's provided and avoids oversimplifying a complex issue. So instead of asking them on a scale from 1 to 3, how do you feel about politics? They may say 5, but then you're oversimplifying, their agreement with it and not really getting into detail. It is more relaxed and more open because you're being able to kind of have a give and take in a conversation. So that makes it good. And people may open up and give answers maybe they wouldn't before. But with unstructured, it's difficult to analyze, like the questionnaire, those multiple responses and so forth. And because that conversation is going to have different questions that might change because you're expanding on an answer they gave, it might be a little time consuming and expensive in order to code all those long stories and so forth. And in general, face-to-face may affect the honesty of the answers because you literally are right there and they know. And then ethical issues, if anything was asked of a participant, maybe, have you ever been abused in your life, and it really like brings up something emotional for them, that could be considered an ethical issue. And then correlation studies, these are not experiments. These are showing something, again, that has a relationship between it, and it's not experimental, so it's considered descriptive. So statistics are used to analyze data from questionnaires. So we might use a questionnaire or even a survey to see if there's any relationship between things, and then we go ahead and do a correlation study. So strength it's useful for making predictions. People use correlation studies in order to then do an experiment to create that validity for causation. And then it shows the relationship between two variables. And it's used when it's unethical to run an experiment that you might not be able to do. For instance, it's unethical to force someone to use Facebook for hours to see if they get depressed. So you might instead correlate depression and see how many people spent time on Facebook and the number of likes they had, and then you could find a relationship between different variables instead of doing an experiment. Also with weaknesses, it only shows a relationship. It doesn't show cause and effect. So it's, having it duplicated and replicated, it doesn't really matter. You're still not showing cause and effect. There may be other factors affecting that. So if you take the depression thing, more texting, lower GPA, but motivation could also be a factor. Also, self-testing might not be the only factor in high test scores. Also would be another thing to think about when you're looking at disadvantages of correlation. It's also hard to know the direction of the correlation, what caused what. As we're going to talk about in class, use of Facebook creating depression. If somebody's depressed, they might be using Facebook to, see, because they're drawn into looking at social media to see what everybody else is doing because they feel bad. So that relationship can be interchanged, and it's hard to do cause and effect unless you've done an experiment.